بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. الحمد لله والصلاة والسلام على سيدنا رسول الله وعلى آله وصحبه ومن والاه. رب اشرح لي صدري ويسر لي أمري واحلل عقدة من لساني يفقه قولي. أما بعد. السلام عليكم ورحمة الله وبركاته. Alhamdulillah, we are quickly approaching the blessed month of Ramadan, and usually in the month of Ramadan we go on hiatus with whatever works we're covering in the halaqah on Friday nights, and the same applies to the work that we're currently studying, the lives of man of Imam Abdullah bin Alawi al-Haddad. We are in the tail end of the second chapter, which is the longest chapter in the book, and that is pertaining to the life in the lower world, the life that we're in right now. We're going to finish this section or this chapter today, inshallah, and next week we have the Ramadan workshop next Friday as well as Saturday, which means that the following Friday we won't be having the Lives of Men halaqah. We'll be announcing a new program for Ramadan. And this section, this final section that we're looking at in chapter 2, is the very final moments before a person transitions from this realm into the next realm. And that is the final stage right before the person dies. Now, last week we were reading the words of Imam Haddad, and he mentioned that in the previous reading that the last period of human life in this world, the decrepitude, ends most commonly with fatal illness and uncommonly with death without illness. And because of that, we do face most of the time some illness that precedes our death. That illness can be a chronic condition, and we ask Allah for health and well-being and protection from chronic conditions, or it could come from something that occurs suddenly. We don't know how we're going to die, under what circumstances. All we can ask for is Allah's protection, His well-being, and a good end. So Imam al-Haddad in the final section of this chapter talks about sickness and death, not as a separate stage of the human experience in this life, but as something experienced in the final stage of decrepitude, assuming the person has not died in one of the earlier stages. Assuming a person reaches into their 70s and beyond, and they are at the age of seniority and decrepitude, he talks about sickness and death and what we should be doing in those final moments. He says, when people fall ill, they should concentrate on asking abundantly for forgiveness, on remembering Allah, and on repenting of prior sins in times of forgetfulness, since they do not know whether this illness will lead to death, their time having come. The door of Tawbah is always open. If a person has lived a life of neglect and committed many sins, the doors are not shut until the soul is removed from the body. When there's the death rattle, the literal sound that can be heard, up until then the doors of Tawbah are opened. And if a person lived their life in negligence, in heedlessness, and in sinfulness, even up until these final moments, the door of Tawbah is still open. So everyone should be in those final moments in a state of asking for forgiveness and in dhikr and repenting of prior sins, as well as repenting of the moments that they wasted, even if it wasn't explicitly in sinful behavior. He says they should therefore conclude their life with good works. For, as the hadith says, إِنَّمَا الْعَمَالُ بِالْخَوَاتِيمِ, For the worth of works lies in the final ones performed. Or we could translate that a little differently and say that the matter is determined by what seals one's life. The actions of a human being are ultimately determined by what seals them. If you imagine you're making some dish, suppose it's some dish that you put ingredients in the bowl. You add the eggs, you add the flour, you add the salt, you add all of the different ingredients, and everything is nice, and you're stirring it. You've done all of this work, and you're ready for it to go into the oven to make a nice pastry or whatever. And then at that final moment, after you've prepared all the ingredients and stirred everything in, you add poison. That poison is what determines the outcome of this pastry. If you then cook it, it will be poisonous. It will be a poisonous pastry. And it doesn't matter that 99% of the work that went into it was with pure ingredients of eggs, of flour, of salt, of butter, or whatever. What matters is that final drop of poison. Likewise in prayer. If you go to pray Salatul Dhuhr, you say Allahu Akbar and you pray Salatul Dhuhr, and you get all the way to the fourth rak'ah, and you're in the tashahhud, and you're just about to say Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah, and in that final moment before you turn your head, you break your wudu. What do? Do you say, oh, well, I was just about to say Assalamu alaikum, so I'm going to count this prayer? You don't do that. And that's because at the final moment, the prayer was invalidated because you broke your wudu, even if you were right at the moment of saying Assalamu alaikum. You have to get up, go make wudu over again, and pray dhuhr once more. It's the same thing for dunya, for the life that we have. That it's those final actions that seal the deal for us. So it's very important that we are mindful of what we are doing in those final moments. And we don't know when the final moment's going to be, which means that we should practice. We should practice for that final moment. And that's why our life should be animated by remembrance of Allah Ta'ala and obedience all of the time. Because it could be in any of those moments that our final moment comes in this life. He says, sicknesses are reminders of the hereafter and the return to Allah Ta'ala. At these times, people should make their legacies, legacy here means a will, and give instructions so that whatever needs to be done, whether for the hereafter or for the world, is actually carried out, especially as regards anything that they owe other people, for these things are serious and hard to extricate oneself from. The main idea is that we have to get ready for death. We don't prepare for death at the moment of death. We prepare for it well before. And if we haven't prepared for it well before, we must prepare for it in those final moments while we still have consciousness and some measure of control and ability to prepare. Chiefly, that's with tawbah, getting things right between us and Allah, and then with making a will. If we haven't made a will, we should make a will. We should do it now. We should not wait until we are on our deathbed and things get confusing and the relatives come and we're too busy dealing with the effects of the sickness to put proper thought into the will. Now in Islam, you have the wasiyah, the will. It's also called a legacy because it's also bequeathing items, personal property to people as gifts. So there's two aspects to this. There's the obligatory manner in which the estate is divided among the relatives, the surviving relatives. And then there's the wasiyah of the legacy of what property can be given and bequeathed to so-and-so and so-and-so. So we want to take care of this part so that there's no confusion about where this goes and where that goes. In addition to this, if we have any debts, we have to make sure that we enumerate those debts so that we see that they're paid for, that they're taken care of. And in the event that we die and we haven't yet paid those debts, our family members need to know, to whom do we owe money and how do they get in contact with them to repay those debts. This is all very important. Very often, too often, we hear people who say, if anyone is owed money by our deceased father or mother, please come see us after the janazah so we can make things straight. Now, that's good. However, if that can be taken care of beforehand by the person themselves, or at least by them informing their family, that's far better, because it gives the chance to repay the debts and make agreements with the debtors, the one to whom money is owed, before the passing. He says, in their illness, they should think exceedingly well of Allah Ta'ala. As it says in the hadith, let none of you die without thinking well of Allah. And again, we don't know when we're going to die. That we take a breath, we inhale, and we exhale. There's no guarantee that we're going to have the next inhalation, and there's no guarantee we're going to have the next exhalation. Neither of those are guaranteed to us. So in every moment, we have to be in the state of one who is ready for death, thinking well of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. He says, let this be the dominant state of the heart. For Allah Ta'ala says in the Hadith Qudsi, أَنَا عِنْدَ الظَّنِّ عَبْدِي بِي, I am as my servant thinks me to be. وَأَنَا عِنْدَهُ, and I am with him when he remembers me. The Prophet ﷺ, he said, once entered the house of a sick young man to visit him and asked him, how are you? The young man replied, hoping in my Lord and fearful of my sins. And the Prophet ﷺ is reported to have said, never do these two things unite in the heart of a Muslim in such a situation as this, except that Allah grants him what he hopes for and gives him safekeeping from what he fears. We have, subhanAllah, we have a lot of detail about the death experience in the Islamic tradition. We have a lot of detail in our eschatology about the unseen realities that we'll face when the soul is removed from the body and when we enter the grave and when we're resurrected. A lot of detail. We also have a lot of rich detail about post-death experiences of individuals from the Muslim community. There's an entire, it's not really a genre of literature, but we have an entire subsection in our Islamic literature about people who died and who were seen after their death in the dreams of friends and family and associates. There's literally thousands of these, thousands of narrations from various time periods in Islamic history where a famous person would die and would later be seen, or shortly after their burial, be seen by a student or a family member or loved one, and the family member would say to them, or the student would say, ماذا فعل الله بك? What did Allah do with you? How did Allah deal with you after death? And we have news of the unseen realm coming in these dreams from those deceased people. And in those we have many very powerful lessons. We have, for instance, Imam Junaid al-Baghdadi. This example comes to mind. When he was a great scholar of the inward and outward sciences of Islam. He was a great spiritual master, a wali from the awliya of Allah. And he had a lot of very deep, mystical, spiritual things to say about being a servant of Allah and purifying the heart. When he died, he was seen in a dream by one of his students. And when asked how Allah dealt with him, he said to the student, ذهبت tilka al-isharat, all of those deep spiritual sayings have gone. And what proved to be of benefit were those short rak'ahs offered in prayer in the darkness of night. Just those brief rak'ahs you pray, just you and Allah, sincerely. Those, he said, were of enduring value. You have so many narrations like this where a scholar who contributed greatly in the Islamic sciences will be seen after his death, and when asked, how did Allah deal with you? You would think they would say something about their scholarly contribution, their scholarly output, maybe their books, maybe their writings, and their contribution to the Islamic sciences. But 9 times out of 10, they say nothing about what they're actually famous for. And they say that they were forgiven on account of something that others would deem very small. And we have one narration in which a hadith scholar was asked, how did Allah deal with you? And he said that Allah forgave me and honored me because I was very careful whenever I wrote the hadith of the Prophet ﷺ to write out and say, Sallallahu alayhi wasallam. To make that dua, to send the salat, the durood, each time writing a hadith report of his. That is seen as small. It's not like he made 25 hajjs and gave millions of dinars in charity. Something that we deem small was deemed very great in the sight of Allah. And of course, this is not revelation. This is not Quran. This is not a hadith. It's coming from the unseen in the dream realm. So it corresponds to Sharia, so we can affirm it. It doesn't abrogate anything. It doesn't add any new rulings. It simply emphasizes the importance of the small, consistent actions of believers as they live their life, trying their best to be servants of Allah. So, going back to the book, he says that hope should be the predominant state in all ill people, especially when the signs of impending death appear, so that they may die thinking well of Allah, hoping strongly for His generosity and the vastness of His mercy, and yearning to meet Him. As it says in the hadith, those who are pleased to meet Allah, Allah is pleased to meet them. And those who dislike to meet Allah, Allah dislikes to meet them. Man ahabba liqa Allah, ahabba liqa'ah, wa man kariha liqa Allah, kariha liqa'ah, or kama qal. We have to also remember that this applies on the micro level as well as the macro level. It applies on the micro level, on the individual level, you and me and every individual Muslim. That should be our state at the time of death, having a good opinion of Allah and having hope. Let that dominate the state of the person as they are about to leave this world. But it also applies on the macro level, because if we look at humanity as a whole, the ummah of humanity as a whole, beginning with Sayyidina Adam alayhi salam and extending all the way to the last human being, if we look at this lifespan of humanity and the various nations that appeared, the ummah of Sayyidina Muhammad sallallahu alayhi wasallam is the last ummah belonging to the last prophet. Therefore, in the human lifespan, in the macro level, we are in the stage of the final decrepitude, or that final stage, the last third of the night before the Day of Judgment, before the end of this world, the end of this cycle. So just as an individual extends hope, and hope predominates over them in their final moments, we as an ummah are the last ummah before the Day of Judgment, which means that we also extend hope and have good opinion of Allah Ta'ala, and that should be the predominant state without it being a delusion. The predominant state should be one of hopefulness and confidence that we are in good hands. He says this is because a Muslim, when death is imminent, receives glad tidings of Allah's mercy and grace. He is therefore pleased to meet him, and Allah is pleased to meet him. A hypocrite, on the other hand, when death is imminent, receives news of Allah's chastisement. He is therefore unhappy to meet him, and Allah is unhappy to meet him. Thus, believers who have taqwa receive glad tidings of Allah's mercy as they leave the world. Their spirits, in their eagerness for their Lord and the meeting with Him, almost fly out of their bodies. They long for the instant when the angels will greet them and give them the tidings that they will enter the garden, and that as of that instant neither fear will afflict them, neither will they grieve. So there's two really important points to bring out of this. Number one, we have, as human beings, a survival instinct. It's completely natural for us to wish to remain in the world. No one with a natural, healthy fitrah, with a natural survival instinct, wants to die and looks forward to death. We have been given the survival instinct by Allah Ta'ala for the purpose of fulfilling our meaning in this world. Our purpose is fulfilled in this world by surviving, by thriving, by enduring and filling the world and being the stewards over the world. وَاسْتَعْمَرَكُمْ فِيهَا. Allah says that He has made you stewards over the earth, which means we have to survive. And out of His mercy, He gave us the survival instinct so that we take the necessary steps to endure in this world. So we have to understand that, because when we hear the hadith, whoever loves to meet Allah, Allah loves to meet him. Maybe when we think about death, we say to ourselves, I'm not ready to die. And there's two main reasons why a person would not be ready to die. Number one, we're not ready to die because we have a survival instinct. That's completely normal. The second reason why a person is not ready to die is because they feel they're not ready. Meaning, they feel they have loose ends. They don't feel that they have a state of purity, a state of closeness to Allah, where if they die in that moment, they feel that they will be safe and sound. They feel, or they know, that there are loose ends in this world that have to be tied. The rights of others that have to be fulfilled. Things they want to do, they want to fulfill, obligations like Hajj, or maybe they have many prayers to make up for their years of the bad old days, or fast to make up, or other things that we call loose ends, spiritually speaking. And if a person feels that, it's a very powerful experience, because it tells them what they need to do to get things right, to meet Allah Ta'ala. And once they've fulfilled those things, and they reach a point where they are satisfied to leave this world, the survival instinct remains. However, at a certain point, you recognize that no one ultimately survives this. No one comes out of the world alive. No one's coming alive out of this. We all die. But we want to be ready to meet Allah Ta'ala and to have that love for meeting Allah Ta'ala. That's the first point we get from this paragraph. The second point is a very important clarification about what it means. He is saying that the feeling of loving to meet Allah is, for the believer, experienced in its greatest manner. It's experienced at the moment when the soul leaves the body. Because at that moment they receive the glad tidings that Allah is pleased with them, that they are receiving Allah's mercy. And in that moment, they are reassured and have great eagerness to meet Allah Ta'ala. On the other hand, the hypocrite and disbeliever, when their soul leaves the body, they see that Allah is displeased with them. They recognize at that moment that their disbelief was a very, very bad choice. And at that moment, they dislike to meet Allah Ta'ala because they know the consequences they're facing. Therefore, if a person is a believer in Allah Ta'ala and they dislike to meet Allah, meaning they feel that they're not ready and they have a survival instinct, that's completely fine. That is not the indication that a person is a hypocrite. That's an indication that we have a healthy fitrah and that we have a purpose to fulfill in this life. And it indicates that we have loose ends that we need to tie, whether it's with regard to the rights of other human beings or whether it is with acts of worship and devotion, and simply getting our hearts in the right state and to purify them so that we feel we are at the level of the nafs al-mutma'inna, the contented soul that is radiya mardiya, that is pleased with its Lord and its Lord is pleased with it. May Allah give us that. Ameen. He goes on to say that ill people who are sick and on their deathbeds, should make sure that no impurities soil their bodies or clothes, thus preventing them from doing the prayer. Let them beware very greatly of abandoning the prayer, for everyone can pray according to his condition, whether sitting, reclining, or in whatever way proves possible. So even the practicalities of our law apply to situations of great difficulty, such as sickness and being on one's deathbed. He's cautioning the sick person to make sure that the impurities are removed, because there's often incontinence, there's often issues with bladder control when a person is in their final moments. Nevertheless, they or their loved ones have to help make sure that those impurities are removed and that they attain the ritual purity, which will either be through wudu or either through the tayammum, the dry wudu. Now, just a word on the dry wudu, because we're all familiar with the wudu with water, and many of us have only very passing familiarity with the tayammum as a practice. There's two forms of tayammum in our legal tradition, and there's obviously some differences between these schools of law when it comes to the prerequisites, the conditions, and what exactly the tayammum permits, what it lifts of ritual impurity and whatnot. But for the sick people, it's really good to know the position of the school of Imam Malik ibn Anas, the al-madhab al-Maliki, because in the Maliki madhab, you have tayammum with dust or dirt or an earthen substance. You also have tayammum with a solid earthen substance, meaning you are allowed to make tayammum not just with dust or a loose earthen substance, but also with a solid earthen substance, which means the sick person, if they're having a hard time making wudu and needs to make tayammum and finds it difficult to get up and find a source of loose dust or dirt, they have the option to use a stone, a flat stone that is ritually pure without impurities on it. And they perform tayammum using the stone the same way they would perform tayammum striking the earth, sa'idan tayyiba, in which they make the intention, they say Bismillah, they strike the earth, and they rub the hands and the face thoroughly, covering the area, but sufficing with striking the stone once. This is a great dispensation. It's in the Maliki school. I'm not sure about the other schools of law, but this is something you find widespread in North Africa, where the Maliki madhab is dominant. In almost any masjid you go to, you're going to find a flat, round, smooth stone in a corner somewhere. And people who don't know this wonder, why are there stones in all of the masajid? And the answer is they are for tayammum. If a person is sick, or if they're recovering from an illness, or it is so cold and they are susceptible to sickness that they're afraid if they use cold water they'll get sick, they have the option of using this stone because of the inability or just the inconvenience even of making tayammum using loose earth. So that's something to add. And one can ensure that they have ritual purity by removing the impurity and staying in ritual purity, tahara, through the tayammum, using the stone, if they can't make wudu. And now if they can make wudu, then they make wudu if it's not a hardship. And that determination is for the person to make. He says, let them beware very greatly of abandoning the prayer, for everyone can pray according to his condition, whether sitting, reclining, or in whatever way proves possible. The prayer is still an obligation, even if a person is on their deathbed. And if a person cannot pray sitting up, they can pray reclining on their back or on their side. They can gesticulate by moving their head, making these movements signifying ruku' and sujud, while saying the dhikr that they say in the prayer. And even if they were paralyzed and unable to move their head, they can move their eyes, signifying the bowing, the rising, and the going into sajda. And even if they can't move their eyes, they can intend in each moment that they are in the position of standing, where they recite Surah Al-Fatiha and another surah, and then the position of ruku', the rising from ruku', the sujud, and the sitting from sujud, all on intention alone, and uttering the dhikr in each posture while they're completely lying dormant, unable to move. So the prayer is always an obligation, even under those very difficult circumstances. When the Prophet ﷺ was in his final moments, it says, "Ughmiya alayh," which means he was overcome. Not really fainted in the way that we understand it, but he was overcome. And when he came to his senses, where he was interacting with others, after that period of immersion in this period before he passed the world, he awakens and says, "Hadarat as-salat." And this is interpreted two different ways. Some narrations say that he's asking the question, has the time for the prayer come? Which is his way of reminding the companions. Or he said, Hadarat as-salat, as a statement, the time for the prayer has come. Reminding them that even in those circumstances of extreme difficulty, prayer is still important. He goes on to say, let them not conclude their works in the world by neglecting their prayer, for it is the pillar of the religion. Any of their relatives or friends who happen to be there should encourage them to perform it, remind and assist them. Remind them of the prayer because they may be forgetting in that state, and assist them in performing it. They should be aware that the obligation to pray remains in force for as long as one is conscious. Allah Ta'ala says in the Quran, وَاعْبُدْ رَبَّكَ حَتَّى يَأْتِيَكَ الْيَقِينَ. Worship your Lord until certainty comes to you. Certainty here is referring to death. Death is described as yaqeen, meaning worship Allah until death comes to you. This world is the abode of moral responsibility, daru taklif. The hereafter is the abode of accountability. The hereafter is not the abode of taklif, of moral responsibility. So prayer is an obligation until our soul leaves the body. He says, let them frequently repeat these words, La ilaha illa anta subhanaka inni kuntu min al-zalimin. The person who is on their deathbed should repeat frequently the dua of Sayyidina Yunus alayhi salam, there is no God but you, transcendent are you, I have been among the wrongdoers. For it's been related that someone who repeats this 40 times and then dies in his illness will die as a martyr. So to say frequently, La ilaha illa anta subhanaka inni kuntu min al-zalimin, La ilaha illa anta subhanaka inni kuntu min al-zalimin, and so on. This is an established practice that one should make when they are on their deathbed. Let them, meaning the family of the deceased, let them also recite Surah Al-Ikhlas in abundance. Sorry, this is for the deceased person, or the person who's on the deathbed, sorry. The person who's on the deathbed should also recite Surah Al-Ikhlas in abundance. Qul huwallahu ahad. There are some phrases concerning which the Messenger of Allah sallallahu alaihi wasallam said, the fire would not feed on whoever repeated them in his illness and then died. So there are certain du'as you can make, and from the prophetic promise, if you say them and die in that state, you will not be consumed by the fire. Some of these are La ilaha illallah wallahu akbar, La ilaha illallah wahdahu la sharika lah, lahul mulku wa lahul hamd, La ilaha illallah wa la hawla wa la quwwata illa billah. Different du'as or different adhkar one can make in the final moments. When the patient seems to be approaching death, those of his family and relatives who are present must watch him. If they notice signs of panic and terror, they must remind him of his good works, the immensity of his Lord's mercy, his forgiveness of the sinful, and his pardon of people of remissness. So basically, as the family of the person on their deathbed, we are responsible for helping them remove any impurities, helping them in performing the wudu if they can perform wudu, or helping them with their tayammum, helping them, reminding them about the prayer, the time of prayer, helping them get up if they can physically get up to pray, or assisting them in whatever way we need to for them to pray, whether it's sitting or standing or reclining, and also to remind them of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, His mercy, His forgiveness, and to give them the inspiration of Allah's mercy so that they have hopes, because it's a very difficult moment and a person may start to panic and they need those reminders. And this has to be done gently. It is not appropriate for the family of the deceased to create more panic in the one who's on his deathbed. And all too often this is the case, unfortunately. They are so caught up in the pain of this inevitable loss that they're breaking down and panicking. And they're so grief-stricken that they're stressing out the person who is on their deathbed. This happens a lot. But it's the job of the person, the family member with the one on his deathbed, to have strength and to inspire that person with hope and to gently remind them of these things. They should not remind them in a forceful manner. And as he will say here, he says, our predecessors, the early generations, encouraged such behavior towards people on their deathbed, and some of them sought it from those present at the time of their own death. Meaning some of them asked their family and loved ones around their deathbed to behave in this manner, to help them out. He says it's a definite obligation that someone who is dying be encouraged to say La ilaha illallah, for the Prophet ﷺ said, make the dying say La ilaha illallah. The translation here is a little off. It says, make the dying say La ilaha illallah, for someone whose last words are La ilaha illallah will enter the garden. The meaning here is not make as in force. It is to transmit and remind them to say La ilaha illallah. And that's to be done gently. So when the person is on their deathbed, as they're in those final moments, the family members should say, either telling him or her to say La ilaha illallah, or remembering it gently themselves, verbalizing it so that the person on the deathbed can hear them. This should be done. What should not be done is the family member going to the person on his or her deathbed and saying in a very forceful tone, say La ilaha illallah, say La ilaha illallah. This causes more fear. One should just be gentle about it. La ilaha illallah, La ilaha illallah. Or say La ilaha illallah in a very gentle manner that is easy for that person in those final moments. He says, when the patient says it once, it is not necessary that he be asked to repeat it, unless he speaks about anything else. In other words, if the person says it once, that's enough. But if they start talking about this or that matter of business or life, things of dunya, they should be reminded once again to say it. But if they've been reminded to say La ilaha illallah and they've said it, they don't need to be reminded to say it again if they're silent. There's a narration, I believe it's in Imam al-Dhahabi's Sir A'lam Nubala, one of the Maqdisi scholars of Palestine. It's reported that when he was on his deathbed, he was lying in bed and all of his family and loved ones were surrounding him, and they were so grief-stricken from the situation that they were among themselves crying and very sad. And he, on his deathbed, told them, "Qulu la ilaha illallah," say la ilaha illallah. He's doing the talqeen to the visitors, to the loved ones, telling them to say la ilaha illallah. And such is the state of the people of dhikr, the people of ibadah, the people of wilayah, that they're the ones reminding others, they're the ones keeping others firm even in those moments. He says the dying may be subject, says here, they should also recite Surah Yasin to the person on the deathbed. As the hadith says, اقرأ على موتاكم Surah Yasin, recite Surah Yasin to your dying. It is said that this makes the departure of the spirit easier, for death, although accompanied by distress and throes, may be rendered easy and bearable to some believers. It's related that the angel of death has said, "I am compassionate with believers and gentle." The dying, he said, may be subject to various kinds of temptation. May Allah protect us. And it is therefore recommended that the people who are present recite Quran in abundance and mention hadith which condemn the things of the world. It's been related that Shaitan, may Allah curse him, is nearest to the servant at the time of his death, eager to tempt him, but that his power is only over those who take him as an ally and those who associate partners with Allah. And as for the people of Iman, Allah confirms those who believe with the firm word in this life and in the next, and Allah sends the unjust astray, and Allah does as He wills. يُثَبِّتُ اللَّهُ الَّذِينَ آمَنُوا بِالْقَوْلِ الثَّابِتِ فِي الْحَيَاةِ الدُّنْيَا وَالْآخِرَةِ. Allah makes firm those who believe with the firm word in this life and in the next. The firm word is La ilaha illallah Muhammadur Rasulullah, and Allah makes them firm with it in this life before they leave the dunya, and firm with it in the grave when they're asked by the angels Munkar and Nakir. Now, what he mentions here is really important because it ties into the early paragraph about saying La ilaha illallah to the deceased and getting them to say it. It is possible that a person who is on their deathbed and in those final moments may be told by their loved ones to say La ilaha illallah, yet they are unresponsive. And we have to be very careful here and not play the role of God and assume that if the family members are telling them to say La ilaha illallah and they're not saying it, that they are therefore having an evil end. And one should not assume by saying to themselves, "Oh, he must be having an evil end. A'udhu billah. We've been telling him to say La ilaha illallah and he doesn't say it." And that is because, as Imam al-Haddad mentions here, Shaitan appears to people, it is possible, and brings temptation. This is possible, and there's a lot of stories that relate to this. Imam al-Qurtubi, in his Tadhkirah, he mentions one incident in particular. And if I'm not mistaken, it was himself. He mentioned, I'm not 100% sure he's referring to himself, but let's assume that it was. He mentioned that he became very ill, deathly ill, and he believed that it was the illness from which he would die. And so as he was lying on his bed, thinking it was his deathbed, his family told him to say La ilaha illallah, Yet he said, no, no, la, la. And a while later, they tried again, telling him, say la ilaha illallah. But he said, no, la, la, la. And ultimately, he recovered from this illness. Obviously, he didn't die from it. And when he recovered, his family members asked him, we were thinking you were about to die, and we were telling you to say La ilaha illallah, but you kept saying no. What's up with that? And he said to them that at that moment, because remember, Shaitan doesn't know that this person is going to die. That person is deathly ill, and it appears to all outside observers that the person is going to die. Shaitan doesn't know the unseen about this person's destiny. He thinks he's going to die. So Imam Qurtubi mentions that him, or the one he's narrating on behalf of, said that at that moment, my father appeared to me in a wakeful vision, yaqadatan, a wakeful vision. Yani he's seeing him in what appears to be a wakeful vision, as if his father is there from the spiritual realm, the barzakh realm. And the father, who was a believer, in this vision is coming to his son and saying, dear son, die as a Christian, for Christianity is the best of ways. Die as a Christian as I did. And the son, who's on his deathbed, or thinks he's on his deathbed, sees this, recognizes it for what it is, and says, La, la, no. And this apparition, this figure, disappears. And later, as the family are telling him to say La ilaha illallah a second time, he's saying no. He told them, because I saw a vision of my mother, and she appeared and said, dear son, die as a Jew, for it is the best of ways. And he said to her, no, no. He recognized that this image of his father and image of his mother was not his actual mother and father, because they died as Muslims. Rather, it was Shaitan impersonating their form. Now, no, any individual, it's possible that Shaitan can impersonate their form, with the exception of Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam, because the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam tells us in the hadith, in the Shama'il, and in other collections, من رآني فقد رآني حقا فإن الشيطان لا يتمثل بي. Whoever has seen me has truly seen me, for Shaitan cannot impersonate me. He cannot take on my likeness. But anyone else, even our parents, Shaitan can take on their likeness. So these are some events that have been recorded in the history, actual experiences people have had. And the lesson for us is that we don't know what is going on in that state of the dying person, what they're actually seeing. So we don't take things for granted, or take it for face value, that if they're not responding to our talqeen of the shahada, that somehow they're dying with an evil end. That's not necessarily the case at all. And he goes on to talk about husn khatima and su' al-khatima, having an evil end and a good end. And I think for the sake of continuity, I'll probably record one other reading of this chapter before next Friday, just an extra one, because there's more to cover here, and due to the lack of time, I don't want to make this lesson span for 2 hours. So inshallah, what I'll do is make another recording where we'll go over this last bit about having an evil end at the time of death and having a good end, what those two things mean, and how we can ensure that inshallah we have a good end at the time of death, and learn what things contribute to having an evil end, as well as the concluding remarks about the matters regarding funerals and janazah prayer and the issues regarding the burial and the grave visitation. A lot of questions come up every now and again when someone passes away. People ask about certain practices, whether they're valid or not, and that's worth talking about so that we have understanding about these matters in our deen. والله ورسوله أعلم وصلى الله وسلم على سيدنا محمد وعلى آله وصحبه وسلم والحمد لله رب العالمين والسلام عليكم ورحمة الله وبركاته.